Hamlet! Pooh! Ridiculous! Hamlet is gone. Perfectly gone.' Quite overcome by these dismal reflections, Mr. and Mrs. Curdle sighed, and sat for some short time without speaking. At length, the lady, turning to Miss Snevellicci, inquired what play she proposed to have. 'Quite a new one,' said Miss Snevellicci, 'of which this gentleman is the author, and in which he plays, being his first appearance on any stage. Mr. Johnson is the gentleman's name.' 'I hope you have preserved the unities, sir?' said Mr. Curdle. 'The original piece is a French one,' said Nicholas. 'There is abundance of incident, sprightly dialogue, strongly marked characters, all unavailing without a strict observance of the unities, sir,' returned Mr. Curdle. 'The unities of the drama before everything.' 'Might I ask you,' said Nicholas, hesitating between the respect he ought to assume and his love of the whimsical, 'might I ask you what the unities are?' Mr. Curdle coughed and considered. 'The unities, sir,' he said, 'are a completeness, a kind of universal dovetailedness with regard to place and time, a sort of general oneness, if I may be allowed to use so strong an expression. I take those to be the dramatic unities, so far as I have been enabled to bestow attention upon them, and I have read much upon the subject, and thought much. I find, running through the performances of this child,' said Mr. Curdle, turning to the phenomenon, 'a unity of feeling, a breadth, a light and shade, a warmth of colouring, a tone, a harmony, a glow, an artistical development of original conceptions, which I look for in vain among older performers. I don't know whether I make myself understood.' 'Perfectly,' replied Nicholas. 'Just so,' said Mr. Curdle, pulling up his neckcloth. 'That is my definition of the unities of the drama.' Mrs. Curdle had sat listening to this lucid explanation with great complacency. It being finished, she inquired what Mr. Curdle thought about putting down their names. 'I don't know, my dear. Upon my word, I don't know,' said Mr. Curdle. 'If we do, it must be distinctly understood that we do not pledge ourselves to the quality of the performances. Let it go forth to the world that we do not give them the sanction of our names, but that we confer the distinction merely upon Miss Snevellicci. That being clearly stated, I take it to be as it were a duty that we should extend our patronage to a degraded stage, even for the sake of the associations with which it is entwined. Have you got 2 and 6pence for half a crown, Miss Snevellicci?' said Mr. Curdle, turning over 4 of those pieces of money. Miss Snevellicci felt in all the corners of the pink reticule, but there was nothing in any of them. Nicholas murmured a jest about his being an author, and thought it best not to go through the form of feeling in his own pockets at all. 'Let me see,' said Mr. Curdle. 'Twice 4's 8, 4 shillings apiece to the boxes, Miss Snevellicci, is exceedingly dear in the present state of the drama. 3 half crowns is 7 and 6. We shall not differ about 6pence, I suppose. 6pence will not part us, Miss Snevellicci?' Poor Miss Snevellicci took the 3 half crowns with many smiles and bends, and Mrs. Curdle adding several supplementary directions relative to keeping the places for them, and dusting the seat, and sending 2 clean bills as soon as they came out, rang the bell as a signal for breaking up the conference. 'Odd people those,' said Nicholas, when they got clear of the house. 'I assure you,' said Miss Snevellicci, taking his arm, 'that I think myself very lucky they did not owe all the money, instead of being 6pence short. Now, if you were to succeed, they would give people to understand that they had always patronised you, and if you were to fail, they would have been quite certain of that from the very beginning.' At the next house they visited, they were in great glory, for there resided the 6 children who were so enraptured with the public actions of the phenomenon, and who, being called down from the nursery to be treated with a private view of that young lady, proceeded to poke their fingers into her eyes and tread upon her toes, and show her many other little attentions peculiar to their time of life. "I shall certainly persuade Mr. Borum to take a private box," said the lady of the house, after a most gracious reception. "I shall only take 2 of the children, and will make up the rest of the party of gentlemen, your admirers, Miss Snevellicci. Augustus, you naughty boy, leave the little girl alone." This was addressed to a young gentleman who was pinching the phenomenon behind, apparently with a view of ascertaining whether she was real. "I am sure you must be very tired," said the mamma, turning to Miss Snevellicci. "I cannot think of allowing you to go without first taking a glass of wine. Fie, Charlotte, I am ashamed of you. Miss Lane, my dear, pray see to the children." Miss Lane was the governess, and this entreaty was rendered necessary by the abrupt behaviour of the youngest Miss Borum, who, having filched the phenomenon's little green parasol, was now carrying it bodily off, while the distracted infant looked helplessly on. "I am sure, where you ever learnt to act as you do," said good-natured Mrs. Borum, turning again to Miss Snevellicci, "I cannot understand, Emma, don't stare so, laughing in one piece and crying in the next, and so natural in all. Oh dear!" "I am very happy to hear you express so favourable an opinion," said Miss Snevellicci. "It's quite delightful to think you like it." "Like it!" cried Mrs. Borum. "Who can help liking it? I would go to the play twice a week, if I could. I dote upon it. Only you're too affecting sometimes. You do put me in such a state, into such fits of crying. Goodness gracious me, Miss Lane, how can you let them torment that poor child so?" The phenomenon was really in a fair way of being torn limb from limb, for 2 strong little boys, one holding on by each of her hands, were dragging her in different directions as a trial of strength. However, Miss Lane, who had herself been too much occupied in contemplating the grown-up actors to pay the necessary attention to these proceedings, rescued the unhappy infant at this juncture, who, being recruited with a glass of wine, was shortly afterwards taken away by her friends, after sustaining no more serious damage than a flattening of the pink gauze bonnet, and a rather extensive creasing of the white frock and trousers. It was a trying morning, for there were a great many calls to make, and everybody wanted a different thing. Some wanted tragedies, and others comedies. Some objected to dancing, some wanted scarcely anything else. Some thought the comic singer decidedly low, and others hoped he would have more to do than he usually had. Some people wouldn't promise to go because other people wouldn't promise to go, and other people wouldn't go at all because other people went. At length, and by little and little, omitting something in this place and adding something in that, Miss Snevellicci pledged herself to a bill of fare which was comprehensive enough if it had no other merit. It included, among other trifles, 4 pieces, divers songs, a few combats, and several dancers, and they returned home pretty well exhausted with the business of the day. Nicholas worked away at the piece, which was speedily put into rehearsal, and then worked away at his own part, which he studied with great perseverance, and acted, as the whole company said, to perfection. And at length the great day arrived. The crier was sent round in the morning to proclaim the entertainments with the sound of bell in all the thoroughfares, and extra bills of 3 feet long by 9 inches wide were dispersed in all directions, flung down all the areas, thrust under all the knockers, and developed in all the shops. They were placarded on the walls too, though not with complete success, for an illiterate person having undertaken this office during the indisposition of the regular bill sticker, a part were posted sideways and the remainder upside down. At 5:30 there was a rush of 4 people to the gallery door. At 6:15 there were at least a dozen. At 6 o'clock the kicks were terrific, and when the elder Master Crummles opened the door, he was obliged to run behind it for his life. 15 shillings were taken by Mrs. Grudden in the first 10 minutes. Behind the scenes the same unwonted excitement prevailed. Miss Snevellicci was in such a perspiration that the paint would scarcely stay on her face. Mrs. Crummles was so nervous that she could hardly remember her part. Miss Bravassa's ringlets